be a mau mau. I wanna be a mau mau, children. I wanna be a mau mau, just like Jomo Kenyatta. I wanna be a mau mau. I wanna be a mau mau, children. I wanna be a mau mau, just like Odinga, Odinga. I wanna be a mau mau. I wanna be a mau mau, children. I wanna be a mau mau, just like Stokely, Carmichael. Hey! I wanna be a mau mau. I wanna be a mau mau, children. I wanna be a mau mau, just like Leo Johnson. Hey!
We ran into some trouble on the road. We had some flat tires. That's because the CIA is cutting out the circulation of the electricity. Said I wanted to apologize for us being late. We had some trouble on the road, and we had some flat tires. As I was coming in, a young man said, "The nigger is here." That's right, baby, the nigger is here, and I'm gonna blow. But we hope the young man will be able to deal. We hope the young man will be able to deal with this paper, because this nigga is going to deliver an intellectual paper for you. This article is entitled "Towards Black Liberation." Was written for the Massachusetts Review. I hope the hunky who called me a nigga reads the Massachusetts Review. Not only him, I hope his mama reads it too. She needs to. The paper theoretically deals with the concept of black power. It ends up by programmatically explaining black power. It attacks the concept of integration as it's currently practiced in this country. Then it deals with the concept of coalition politics as explained by the major coalition exponents in the country, notably Mr. Bayard Rustin. It then goes on to, you gonna have those lights? It then goes on to point out the difference between individual acts of racism and institutionalized racism. One of the most pointed illustrations of the need for black power as a positive and redemptive force in a society degenerating into a form of totalitarianism is to be made by examining the history of distortion that the concept has received in the national media of publicity. In this debate, as in everything else that affects our lives, black people are dependent on and at the discretion of forces and institutions within white society which have little interest in representing us honestly. Our experience with the national press has been that where they've managed to escape a meretricious special interest in get whitey sensationalism and race war mongering, individual reporters and commentators have been so conditioned by the developing racism of the society to the point where they're incapable even of objective observation and reporting of racial incidents, much less the analysis of ideas. But this limitation of vision and perception is an inevitable consequence of the dictatorship of definition, interpretation, and consciousness, along with the censorship of history that the society. See, they're only upset because we've learned their language better than them. or to speak it in Swahili. It is an inevitable consequence of the dictatorship of definitions, interpretation, and consciousness, along with the censorship of history that the society has afflicted upon black people and consequently upon itself. Our concern for black power addresses itself directly to this problem, the necessity for black people to reclaim our history and our identity from the cultural terrorism and depredation of self-justifying white guilt. Amen. To do this, we shall have to struggle for the right to create our own terms through which to define ourselves and our relationships to the society, and to have these terms recognized. This is the first necessity of a free people, and the first right that any oppressor must suspend. Now, I think that's very important, the need to define. The existentialist philosophers talk about that all the time, notably Mr. Kwame and Mr. Sartre. I read them in a white school. And what happens is that if you cannot define, you are defined by forces greater than you. Now, white Western society, as opposed to white Western civilization, has defined everybody in the world. An example for us would be the cowboy and the red man pictures. You know, you see them fighting all the time, and the white man is losing, so he calls out the cavalry, and the cavalry come out, and they ride very white and very proper, and they get off their horses, and they shoot all the red men. And then they ride back to the fort, and at the fort, there's a white woman standing there, and she says, "What happened?" He says, "We have won. We've had a victory. Everybody's happy." Now, when the reverse happens, when the red man beat the hell out the white man, and he goes back to the fort, and the white woman asks him what happens, he says, "The dirty Indians, they massacred us." And you've got to understand the difference, because the connotation is that a victory is much more honorable than is a massacre. In a victory, you shoot people to death. In a massacre, you cut them to death. And we all know that if we are going to die, we would rather be shot to death than cut to death. Now, you see that even more with the editorial twins of America, Huntley and Brinkley. And what they usually do is that when they talk about Vietnam, they say dirty, filthy, Vietnam, Viet Cong, communist, guerrilla forces threw a Molotov cocktail wounding our civilians. And you get a flashback, and the other cats in Washington, Brinkley says, "Meanwhile, our good boys have been bombing the hell out of North Vietnam." So that the questions of definitions are very important. And since I'm in such a good group, I ought to show what they did to us a couple of years ago. Black people would get up and say that we want to integrate. And in their minds, and in the minds of all black people, they were talking about good schools, good houses, good jobs, and good places to live. But some hunky would jump up and say, "You want to marry my daughter, don't you?" And they would start defining the black man's term for him, and the black man would start reacting to their definition. He would say, we don't want to marry your daughter. We don't want to be your brother-in-law. We just want to be your brothers, and all that nonsense. Now, they ask us in SNCC, and we tell them to the point. Your sister, your daughter, your mama, dig it. The white woman is not the queen of the world. She's not the Virgin Mary. She can be made like anybody else. Let's move on. Let's move on. Let's move on. And you now have an attempt to do that today. When we say black power, some hunky jumps up and says, "You mean violence." And they want me to say, boss man, we don't mean violence. Later for you, we know what we mean. That's all that counts. You will recognize our definition. Okay. The white fathers of American racism knew this instinctively, it seems, as is indicated by the continuous record of the distortion and omission in their dealings with the red and black men. In the same way that the Southern apologists for the Jim Crow Society have so obscured, muddied, and misrepresented the record of the Reconstruction period until it is almost impossible to tell what really happened. Their contemporary counterparts the racist press, who never have any black members with them, are busy doing the same thing with the recent history of the civil rights movement. In 1964, for example, the National Democratic Party, led by L.B. Johnson and boy wonder H.H. Humphrey. We call them Batman and Robin and Snick because they run a very camp government. And in the black community, H.H. Humphrey stands for handkerchief head Humphrey. A handkerchief head is someone who is more obsequious than an Uncle Tom. He's an unconditional yes man. Did you dig television January and February when Johnson delivered his State of the Johnson message to the Union? Well, if you notice that the cameras were focused on Lyndon Baines Johnson, in the background you could see Humphrey. Well, these two cats cynically undermine the efforts of Mississippi's black population to achieve some degree of political representation. We're speaking now of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party challenge that took place in 1964 in Atlantic City at the National Democratic Party Convention. Yet, whenever the events of the convention are recalled by the press, one sees only that version fabricated by the press agents of the Democratic Party. A year later, the House of Representatives, in an even more vulgar display of political racism, made a mockery of the political rights of Mississippi's black people when they failed to unseat the Mississippi delegation to the House, which had been elected through a process which systematically excluded over 450,000 voting-age black people, almost one half of the total electorate of that state. Yet, 2 years later, the same House is unable to unseat Mr. Adam Clayton Powell because he does the same thing they do, but with more style. Whenever this event is mentioned in print, it is in terms which leaves one with a rather curious impression that somehow the oppressed black people of Mississippi are at fault for confronting the Congress with a situation in which they had no alternatives but to endorse Mississippi's racist political practices. I mention these two examples because, having been directly involved in them, I can see very clearly the discrepancies between what happened and the versions that are finding their way into general acceptance as a kind of popular mythology. Thus, the victimizations of black people in this country takes place in two phases. First, it occurs in fact and deed, and then, and this is equally sinister, it occurs in the recording of those facts and deeds. The Black Power program and concept, which is being articulated by the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the Congress of Racial Equality, and a host of community organizations in the ghettos of the North and South, has not escaped that process. The white press has been busy articulating their own analyses, their own interpretations, and criticisms of their own creations. And we were quite disturbed about that because all we said were two simple words, Black Power. And the whole white world came down on us for it, and they began to tell us what was wrong. And I couldn't figure out what was happening until I read George Bernard Shaw. He's got a phrase which is quite apropos for all people who criticize Black Power. He says, all criticism is in fact an autobiography. For example, while the press had given wide and sensational dissemination to attacks made by figures in the civil rights movement, foremost among which are Mr. Roy Wilkins of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People and Mr. Whitney Young of the National Urban League, and to the hysterical rantings about black racism made by the political chameleon that now serves as vice president, it has generally failed to give accounts of the reasonable and productive dialogue which has taken place in the black community and in certain areas in the religious and intellectual communities. A national committee of influential black churchmen affiliated with the National Council of Churches, despite their obvious respectability and responsibility, had to resort to a paid advertisement to articulate their position, while anyone shouting the hysterical yappings of black racism got ample space. Thus, the American people have gotten at best a superficial and misleading account of the very terms and tenor of this debate. I wish to quote from the statement by the National Committee of Churchmen, which I suspect the majority of Americans will not have seen. It appeared in the New York Times, July 3-1 of last year. I want to quote it at length because I think it's important for you to know that inside the black community there are some intelligent people other than the ones you always see denouncing black power. I quote, "We, an informal group of Negro churchmen in America, are deeply disturbed about the crisis brought upon our country by historic distortions of important human realities in the controversy about black power. What we see shining through the variety of rhetoric is not anything new, but the same old problem of power and race which has faced our beloved country since 1619. The conscience of black men is corrupted because having no power to implement the demands of conscience, the concern for justice in the absence of justice becomes a chaotic self-surrender. Powerlessness breeds a race of beggars. We are faced now with a situation where powerless conscience meets conscienceless power. I would like to repeat that phrase because I believe it is axiomatic to race relations in the country today. We are faced now with a situation where powerless conscience meets conscienceless power, threatening the very foundations of our nation. We deplore the overt violence of riots, but we feel it is more important to focus on the real sources of these eruptions. These sources may be embedded inside the ghetto, but their basic cause lies in the silent and covert violence which white middle-class America inflicts upon the victims of the inner city. In short, the failure of American leaders to use American power to create equal opportunity in life as well as law, this is the real problem and not the anguished cry for black power. Without the capacity to participate with power, that is to have some organized political and economic strength to really influence people with whom one interacts, integration is not meaningful. America has asked its Negro citizens to fight for opportunity as individuals, whereas at certain points in our history, what we have needed most has been opportunity for the whole group, not just for selected and approved Negroes. We must not apologize for the existence of this form of group power, for we've been oppressed as a group and not as individuals. We will not find our way out of that oppression until both we in America accept the need for Negro Americans as well as for Jews, Italians, Poles, and white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, among others, to have and to wield group power." End of quote. Traditionally, for each new ethnic group, the route to social and political integration into America's pluralistic society has been through the organization of their own institutions with which to represent their communal needs within the larger society. Simply stated, this is what the advocates of black power are talking about. The strident outcry, particularly from the liberal community, that has been evoked by this proposal can only be understood by examining the historic relationship between black people and white power in this country. Blacks are defined by two forces, our blackness and our powerlessness. There have been traditionally two communities in America, the white community, which controls and defines the forms that all institutions within the society would take, and the black community, which has been excluded from participation in the power decisions that shaped the society and has traditionally been dependent upon and subservient to the white community. This has not been accidental. The history of every institution of this society indicates that a major concern in the ordering and structuring of the society has been the maintaining of the black community in its condition of dependence and oppression. This has not been on the level of individual acts of racism between individual whites against individual blacks, but as total acts by the white community against the black community. This fact cannot be too strongly emphasized, that the racist assumptions of white superiority have been so deeply ingrained in the structure of this society that it infuses the entire functioning and is so much a part of the national subconscious that it is taken for granted and is frequently not even recognized. Let me give an example of the difference between individual racism and institutionalized racism, and the society's response to both. When unidentified hunkies bomb a black church and kill 5 black children, that is an act of individual racism, widely deplored by most segments of the society, black and white. But when in that same city, Birmingham, Alabama, not 5, but 500 black babies die each year because of lack of proper food, shelter, and medical facilities, and 1,000 more black people are maimed physically, emotionally, and intellectually because of conditions of poverty and deprivation in the ghetto, that is a function of institutionalized racism. Yes. But the society either pretends it doesn't know of this situation or is incapable of doing anything meaningful about it. And this resistance to doing anything meaningful about conditions in the ghetto comes from the fact that the ghetto is itself a product of a combination of forces and special interest inside the white community. And the groups that have access to the resources and power to change that situation benefit politically and economically from the existence of that ghetto. It is more than a figure of speech to say then that the black community in America is the victim of white imperialism and colonial exploitation. This is in practical, economic, and political terms true. It is a truism. There are over 20 million black people comprising 10% of this nation. For the most part, we live in well-defined areas of the country, in the shanty towns and rural black belt areas of the South, and increasingly in the slums of northern and western industrial cities. If one goes into any black community, whether it be Jackson, Mississippi, Cambridge, Maryland, Harlem, New York, or Austin, Texas, one will find that the same combination of political, economic, and social forces are at work. The people in the black community do not control the resources of that community, its political decisions, its law enforcement, even its housing standards, even the physical ownership of the land, houses, and stores lie outside that community. It is white power that makes the laws, and it is violent white power in the form of armed white cops that enforces those laws with guns and nightsticks. The vast majority of black people in this country live in these captive communities and must endure these conditions of oppression because and only because we are black and powerless. I do not suppose that at any point the men who control the power and resources of this country ever sat down and designed these black enclaves and formally articulated the terms of their colonial and dependent status, as was done, for example, by the apartheid government of South Africa, which this country supports. Yet, one cannot distinguish between one ghetto and another. As one moves from city to city, it is as though some malignant, racist planning unit had done precisely this, designed each one from the same master blueprint. And indeed, if the ghetto had been formally and deliberately planned, instead of growing spontaneously and inevitably from the racist functioning of the various institutions that combine to make the society, the situation would be somehow less frightening. The situation would be less frightening because if these ghettos were the result of design and conspiracy, one could understand their similarity as being artificial and consciously imposed upon qualities rather than the result of identical patterns of white racism which repeats themselves in cities as distant as Boston is to Watts. Without bothering to list the historic factors which contribute to this pattern, economic exploitation, political impotence, discrimination in employment and education, one can see that to correct this pattern will require far-reaching changes in the basic power relationships and the ingrained social patterns within the society. The question is, of course, what kinds of changes are necessary and how is it possible to bring them about? In recent years, the answer to these questions, which has been given by a most articulate group of black people and their white allies, the liberals of all stripes, has been in terms of something called integration. According to the advocates of integration, social justice will be accomplished by, and I quote, integrating the Negro into the mainstream institutions of the society from which he has been traditionally excluded, end of quote. It is very significant that each time I have heard this formulation, it has been in terms of the Negro, the individual Negro, rather than in terms of the entire black community. This concept of integration had to be based on the assumption that there was nothing of value in the black community and that little of value could be created among black people. So the thing to do was to siphon off the acceptable black people into the surrounding middle-class white community. Thus, the goals of the movement for integration was simply to loosen up the restrictions barring the entries of black people into the white community, goals around which the struggle took place, such as public accommodation, open housing, job opportunity on the executive level, are quite simply middle-class goals articulated by a tiny group of black people who had middle-class aspirations. Now, I do think that the press media had quite a bit to do with the interpretation of that movement because we used to sit and watch them interpret our movement. For example, I would be in Alabama and I would see the editorial twins on TV and they would say, black people were marching today in Alabama. They were beaten down by Jim Clark. They were shot at. They were ridden over. They were horsewhipped. They were cattle prod. But alas, they are still marching to integrate. And then the next day he would say, black people from the north have come to join their black brothers from the south. They are marching again in Selma. They have been beaten. They have been ridden over with horses. They have been whooped. They have been kicked. They have been cattle prodded. They have been sent to jail, but they're still marching to integrate. And I sat down and figured out the logical conclusion of that. It meant that I left New York to come and sit next to Jim Clark's mother or daughter or some other person like that. Obviously, that's not what we came to do. We went to Alabama to render that hunky impotent over our lives. Big difference. Big difference. Big difference. One is that you're fighting to sit next to somebody. Fighting against white supremacy is that you're fighting to render somebody impotent over your life who has no right to be ruling you. There is a big difference. But the society had to say that we were fighting to integrate because they saw us as a biblical people, very religious, and we were like Job-like. Though they may slay us, yet will we serve them. Yeah. Well, I want it made known that I don't want to sit next to that hunky's daughter, sister, or his mama, and will not sit next to them until they become civilized. Such a limited class orientation was reflected not only in the programs and goals of the civil rights movement, but in its tactics and organizations. It is very significant that the two oldest and most respectable civil rights organizations have I am sorry, I can only say 3/5 of that word. Let me spell it for you. CONSTITUTIONS. When we become 5/5, I'll be able to say the whole word. But anyway, they have these things which specifically prohibit partisan political activity. The Congress of Racial Equality once did, but changed that clause when it's changed its orientation towards black power. But this is perfectly understandable in terms of the strategy and goals of the older organizations. The civil rights movement saw its role as a kind of liaison between the powerful white community and the dependent black one. The dependent status of the black community apparently was unimportant, since if the movement were successful, it was going to blend into the white community anyway. We made no pretense of organizing and developing institutions of community power in the black community, but in appealing to the conscience of white institutions of power. The posture of the civil rights movement was that of the dependent, the suppliant. The theory was that without attempting to create any organized base of political strength itself, the civil rights movement could, by forming coalitions with various of the liberal pressure organizations in the white community, such as liberal reform clubs, labor unions, and church groups, progressive civic groups, and at times one or other of the major political parties, influence national legislation and national social patterns. I think we've all seen the limitations of this approach. We have repeatedly seen that political alliances based on appeals to conscience and decency are chancy things, simply because institutions and political organizations have no consciences outside their own special interests. The political and social rights of black people have been and always will be negotiable and expendable the moment they conflict with the interest of our allies. If we do not learn from history, the philosopher Santayana reminds us, then we are doomed to repeat it. And this is precisely the lesson that we've learned from the Reconstruction period. During that time, there came into being something which was called the Populist Party. One of its major spokesmen was a man by the name of Mr. Tom Watson, who hailed from Georgia. Mr. Watson was running for a county position in Georgia. The black population percentage-wise in that county was 40%, voting age population. He needed that 40% in order to win. And so just like some modern-day liberals who need the black vote in order to win the presidential election in 1972, he began to expostulate some liberal nonsense, encouraging black people to vote with poor whites. And black people went into the populist movement unorganized. When Mr. Watson tried to make the Populist Party a national party, and he decided to extend it first to the West before trying to take on the industrial East, the economic interests of the farmers whom he wanted to ally with conflicted with the economic interest of black people. So he became a racist, led lynch mobs, and drove black people out of the party. This was developed before black people could develop any independent base of political strength in the South strong enough to challenge that decision. Obviously, we're learning from history. Today, we will not go into any party unless we are first organized independently and know our strength. So if they decide to throw us out of the party, at least we can disrupt it. Thus, at this point in the struggle, black people have no assurance save a kind of idiot optimism and faith in a society whose history is one of racism, that if it were to become necessary, even the painfully limited gains thrown to the civil rights movement by the Congress will not be revoked as soon as a shift in political sentiment should occur. But the major limitation of this approach was that it tended to maintain the traditional dependence of black people and of the movement. They depended upon the goodwill and support of various groups within the white community whose interests were not always compatible with ours. To the extent that we depended on the financial support of other groups, we were vulnerable to their influence and domination. Also, the program that evolved out of this coalition was really limited and inadequate in the long term, and one which affected only a small, selected group of black people. Its goal was to make the white community accessible to qualified blacks, and presumably each year a few more blacks armed with their passports, a couple of university degrees, would escape into white middle-class America and adopt the attitudes and lifestyles of that group. And one day, the Harlems and the Watts would stand empty, a tribute to the success of integration. This is simply neither realistic nor is it particularly desirable. You can integrate communities, but you assimilate individuals. Even if such a program were possible, its result would be not to develop the black community as a functional and honorable segment of the total society with its own cultural identity, life patterns, and institutions, but to abolish it, the final solution to the race problem in this country. Karl Marx reminds us that the working class is the first class that wished to abolish itself. If one were to listen closely to some of our moderate Negro leaders, you would think that black people were the first people that wished to abolish themselves. The fact is that what must be abolished is not the black community, but the dependent colonial status that has been inflicted upon that community. The racial and cultural personality of the black community must be preserved, and the community must win its liberation while preserving its cultural integrity. This is the essential difference between integration as it is currently practiced and the concept of black power. And what has the movement for integration accomplished to date? That a black person graduating from MIT with a doctorate will have better job opportunities available to him than to Linda Bird Johnson. But the rate of unemployment in the black community is steadily increasing, while that in the white community decreases. More educated blacks hold executive jobs in major corporations and federal agencies than ever before. But the gap between white income and black income has almost doubled in the last 20 years. More suburban housing is available to black people if they can stand the rocks, but housing conditions in the ghetto are steadily declining. While the infant mortality rate of New York City is at its lowest rate ever in the city's history, the infant mortality rate of Harlem is steadily climbing. This explains why the rate of school dropouts is increasing among black teenagers, who then express their bitterness, hopelessness, and alienation by the only means they have, through imitating this society via violence. As long as people in the ghettos of our large cities feel that we are the victims of the misuse of white power without any way to have our needs represented, and these are frequently simple needs, we will continue to have rebellions. These are not the products of black power, but of the absence of any organization capable of giving the community the power, the black power it needs to deal with its problems. SNCC proposes that it is now time for the black liberation movement to stop pandering to the fears and anxieties of a white middle class in the attempt to earn its goodwill, and to return to the ghetto to organize these communities to control themselves. This organization must be attempted in the northern and southern urban areas, as well as in the rural black belt areas in the South. The chief antagonist to this organization is in the South, the overtly racist Democratic Party, and in the North, the equally corrupt and just as racist big city machine. The standard argument presented against independent political organization is, but you are only 10%. I cannot see the relevance of this observation, since no one is talking about taking over the country, because God knows we wouldn't know what to do with this monster, but taking control over our own communities. The fact is, The fact is that the black population, 10% or not, is very strategically placed because, ironically, of segregation. What is also true is that black people have never been able to utilize the full voting potential of our numbers. Where we could vote, the case has always been that the white political machine stacks and gerrymanders the political subdivisions in our neighborhoods so that true voting strength is never reflected in political strength. Would anyone looking at the distribution of political power in Houston, Texas, ever think that black people represented 25% of the population there? Just as often, the effective political organization in black communities is absorbed by tokenism and patronage, the time-honored practice of giving certain offices to selected black people. The machine thus creates a little machine which is subordinate and responsive to the machine inside the black community. These so-called black political leaders are really vote deliverers, more responsible to the white machine and the white power structure than to the community they allegedly represent. Thus, the white community is able to substitute patronage control for what Mr. Powell calls audacious black power in the black community. This is precisely what LBJ tried to do even before the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed. The National Democrats made it clear, crystal clear, that the measure was intended to register Democrats, not black people. The president and top officials of the Democratic Party called in almost 100 selected Negro leaders from the Deep South. Nothing was said about changing the policies of the racist state parties. Nothing was said about repudiating such leadership figures as Eastland and Ross Barnett in Mississippi, or George and Lorleen Wallace in Alabama. But we have nothing to say about the lady from Alabama, because we've just come to find out that the governor of Alabama is a mother. And in SNCC, we're for motherhood. What was simply said, and I quote, would go home and organize your local people into the Democratic Party. Then we'll see about poverty money and appointments, my fellow American. We must organize black community power to end these abuses and to give the black community a chance to have its needs expressed. A leadership which is truly responsible not to the white press and to the power structure, but to the community will be developed. Such leadership will recognize that its power lies in the unified and collective strength of the black community. This will make it difficult for the white leadership group to conduct its dialogue with individuals in terms of patronage and prestige, and will force them to talk to the community's representatives in terms of real black power. The single aspect, then, of the Black Power program that has encountered most criticism is this concept of independent political organization. This is presented as third-partyism, which has never worked, or a withdrawal into black nationalism and black isolationism, which yields to reverse racism. If such a program is developed, it will not have the effect of isolating the black community, but the reverse. When the black community is able to control local offices and negotiate with other groups from a position of organized strength, the possibility of meaningful political alliances on specific issues will be increased. That is a rule of politics, and there is no reason why it should not operate here. The only difference is that we will have the power to define the terms of these alliances. The next question usually is, so, can it work? Can the ghettos in fact be organized? The answer is that this organization must be successful because there are no viable alternatives, not the war on poverty, which was at its inception limited to dealing with effects rather than causes, and has become simply another source of machine patronage, and integration is meaningful only to a small chosen class within the black community. The revolution in agricultural technology in the South is displacing the rural black community into the northern and southern urban areas. Both Washington, D.C. and Newark, New Jersey already have black majorities. 1/3 of Philadelphia's population of 2 million people is already black. The inner city in most major urban areas is already predominantly black. And with the white rush to suburbia, blacks will in the next 2 decades control the hearts of these great cities. These areas can become either concentration camps with a bitter population whose only power is the power to destroy, or organized and powerful communities able to make constructive contributions to the total society without the power, the black power, to control our lives and our communities, without effective political institutions through which to relate to the total community. Our communities will exist in a constant state of insurrection. This is a choice that white America will have to make. Thank you. We are ready to answer questions. I'm just waiting for the MC to come on up so we can get right to it.
The question is this. He asked what Stokely thinks about a positive reaction. He says there's been a positive reaction by people like Bill Buckley of conservatives to the idea of black power. We would like you to comment on it.
Well, I don't know what their reasons are for being for black power. I would think that if they knew what was happening, they'd be against black power. I have no reaction to it because I'm not really concerned with the reaction of white people to black power. I'm concerned with the reaction of black people to black power.
Okay, the guy right there. You, yeah.
The last sentence in your speech, Mr. Carmichael, was that it was up to white America. It seems to me that the whole speech was that it's up to black America. And I wanted to ask a what-if question. What if the ghetto just can't be organized? You said we must do it. Let's hope it can be. What if it can be?
The question is, what if the ghetto can't be organized?
Well, I've just never entertained that in my mind. I know that it can be organized. Black people can come together. I don't know how it could not be organized, and I don't understand. What do you mean, on the part of black people, are they just not willing to come together?
There's been a lot of groups that never got organized.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. But we can organize ourselves this time around.
Stokely, obviously I'm getting discriminated against here. I mean, I like to ask the question. And if I possibly should, I can come up there.
It's up to him.
I don't bite.
It's up to him.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm afraid I don't know many of you, but I have a couple of words I'd like to say to Mr. Carmichael here.
It's a question, right?
Right. First of all, let me tell him one thing. I'm very disappointed in him as a rebel rouser because I was very bored by him. Number one.
Ask the question. Ask the question.
Mr. Carmichael, and I find it very difficult to call you Mr. Carmichael.
Just ask the question. Ask the question.
Ask your question.
Ask the question.
Where did you get your information? Where did you get your information that all executives were college graduates from MIT?
Well, I didn't know that I said that all graduates who worked in the federal government came from MIT. If you like, I would requote the boring quote for you so you can get it correctly in your mind.
Good.
Get another question.
What has the movement for integration accomplished to date? That the Negro graduating from MIT with a doctorate will have better job opportunities available to him than to Linda Bird Johnson?
Number one.
You can go on. I'll play with him. It's all right.
Okay, since obviously my president isn't desired up here, I'd like to ask him one question. Will he debate me in a formal or informal debate anytime, any place, anywhere?
Baby, I make it public. I'm going to pay your airplane ticket first class to come to Harlem and debate me. I never debate a black man in front of white people.
Okay, the fellow there waving his hand. Yeah, you. The question is, the man says he has a friend who just went to jail for 2.5 years rather than go to Vietnam. He would like to know what Mr. Carmichael thinks of that.
I think he's great, absolutely great. Because I think it is more honorable to inflict suffering, to suffer, than to inflict suffering. I think it is more honorable to be confined in jail knowing that one is not a murderer than to be walking outside knowing that one is a murderer.
I've got a little bit of a prejudice. There's a fellow here from Fort Worth. You want to ask your question? The question is there any chance that the civil rights and peace movements can unite?
Well, I think they can form coalitions. I don't think they can unite because I think the peace movement is talking about peace and black people talking about liberation. And there's a big difference because as far as we're concerned, there ain't going to be no peace till we get our liberation.
There's a fellow there standing up with a white shirt and a black tie. The question is he to understand what he used to think was a brotherhood movement is contradictory with the Black Power movement?
Wait, I'm not sure I understand that. Could you explain a little bit more? Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah, well, the difference is that in the past, people were fighting to integrate. I don't think integration is what you fight for. Oh. Yeah, I am refuting that. I think that the approach for black people must be at institutionalized racism, not individual acts of racism. Question. And question 2 is what active part can a concerned, compassionate white person play in this part? Well, he can move into the white community and start organizing it on several levels. On the first level, he can begin to organize poor whites who are politically and economically disenfranchised so that they can begin to fight for the power from which they have been robbed. On the second level, he can begin to organize them and teach them nonviolence because they really need it. That is, he can teach it to people like Jim Clark and to Ross Barnett and those cats rather than to us. They should get some. If they're a minority, why are they governing? Because of what?
Because you pick up a newspaper that says they're governing.
Oh no, I'm afraid that Laurleen Wallace governs Alabama. I'm afraid she does. I'm afraid that Eastland is the senator from Mississippi with his racist counterpart, Stennis. I'm afraid that Strong, Thurman, Talmadge, and Russell are all sitting up there in the Senate. I'm afraid that Paul B. Johnson is in fact governor of Mississippi. I'm also afraid that De La Beckwith is running for a position in the state of Mississippi and will probably win. Oh, Jim Clark is indeed sheriff of Dallas County. I can just go down. That's not what I read in the newspaper.
None of this would be possible if white people or black people could really communicate.
Oh no, black people have always been willing to communicate. White people know that. They've always communicated with us after sundown. I would think the best thing you can do is to move into the white community to start to begin to help civilize it so that it will recognize the humanity of black people.
Okay, let's see. Fellow over here with the red tie.
Is it symbolic?
The question is why Stokely's followers, if not he, calls other colored brothers Uncle Toms.
You would have to ask my so-called followers that question.
Here I am, baby. Here I am.
The question is, what are we going to do with the Uncle Toms who do not agree with us? Are we going to slit their throats? No, they're going to be our token integration boys.
Okay, there's a man holding a book there. Okay, after the fellow with the book. The question is this, that Stokely has talked about political power and about people having domination in ghettos. The man says that economics governs the country as well as politics, and what would Mr. Carmichael suggest be done to give black people more economic power than they have?
I do not think that it's possible for black people to move into the economic arena of the country right now because it's just too tight in terms of the fact that it's governed by stocks and bonds, and there are no openings to get that. So one of the things we can begin to do then is in our own community begin to develop cooperative programs which we can use as a stopgap measurement for, well, we'll use as a stopgap measurement until we can develop enough political power to then bargain for economic power.
Okay, we got.
All right, I want to ask one question. As a recent returned veteran from Vietnam, do you think that after this Vietnamese war is over, if it's over, with the understanding that the French have been fighting for 20 years, do you think that the black man is going to come back after fighting for the white man and not fight for himself?
Are you the one who's the veteran, or were you just? Okay. He says he's a veteran from Vietnam, and he wants to know if Mr. Carmichael thinks. He wants to know if Mr. Carmichael thinks that black people are going to come back from fighting in Vietnam and not fight for themselves.
The last. Yeah, well, the question is, and he who laughs last laughs best. And while my brother here is a veteran, he wants to know if I think it's possible for black people who have been used to fight in Vietnam, a white man's war, to come back here and not fight for his rights. Well, you know the answer to that question is some of us ain't even going to Vietnam. We're going to fight here first.
Okay, fella right here in the blue shirt. He wants to know what the cloth that Stokely's shirt is made of means in terms of black culture.
It's from Nigeria, which is in Africa, and they're doing some beautiful things. It's not a beatnik shirt.
Okay, Mr. Green here has a question.
Carmichael, I would like to ask you if you are in support of the Constitution and the government of the United States of America.
Let me introduce this fella.
Or do you advocate an overthrow of the American government here at home?
You want to repeat the question?
The question is whether or not I believe in the Constitution of the United States, or whether or not I believe in overthrowing the government here at home. Is that your question? Which one in the Constitution? The one that makes me 3/5? I want to know which one you're talking about.
Now, present United States Constitution.
You're talking about the United States Constitution. I understand the United States Constitution started off with a Declaration of Independence, which says, when in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve. I am answering your question. I gave you courtesy. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth a just and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's gods entitle them, a decent respect to the opinion of mankind state that they should declare the reasons that cause them to this separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equally, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights.
You belong with the hunkies.
That among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that when any form of governments are instituted among people deriving their right to govern from the consent of the governed, and that when any government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to alter and to abolish it, laying its foundations on such principles that you to them deem so necessary to ensure their happiness. Now, you talking about that Constitution? Yeah. Now, if you're talking about that Constitution, I'm fighting to uphold that Constitution. I'm just trying to show the hunkies that they are to uphold it too, because they taught it to me.
Make it plain, brother. Make it plain.
But if you talk about a Constitution which has for 100 years denied me the right to vote, then I'm trying my best to overthrow that, Mama Jama.
Okay, we've still got some time. I want to see a question that's hotter than Mr. Green's. Over here with the white shirts.
The question is...
Go to bed.
The question is that what can black students here at this college do? At any college? Well, the first thing y'all do, this guy is to organize yourself because you need help.
Brother, make it plain.
And then what you ought to do is to get the skills and techniques that you learn at this college and bring it back to your black brothers in the rural areas and in the ghettos who need your skills. You should bring your education back to us so that we can use them to better ourselves as a race of people.
About 15 minutes. Okay, we still have a little time. Okay, the fellow with the red button, brown shirt, yellow button.
Mr. Carmichael, when do you think black men in America will achieve full black power? Give any comment at all?
The question is, when Mr. Carmichael thinks that black people in America will achieve full black power, the fellow said.
Well, we get our program in terms of a long struggle. We see that we won't begin to see the semblance of that until around 1972, where hopefully if we're organized, we can make the weight of our strength felt in the national election, and then moving on from there. But it's at least a 5-year organizing plan. Oh, we gonna do it.
There's a fellow way back there. There you go. The question is whether or not Mr. Carmichael sees black people in the United States as a permanently identifiable minority.
Yes, I do, and we're proud of it.
Tell him about it.
Okay, there's a... Yeah, right there.
You have said that you're mainly interested in your own community, and yet sometimes you do address yourself to society as a whole. Sometimes this has the effect, I have seen you tonight and you are very articulate. You state a good case for your own cause. However, many of the black power approaches to the whole of society are very frightening to that society, and they make your case much more harder, don't you think? Are there not things you could say which will help the white man get out of his problems with the press and other things like that?
Good question, bro. Gosh.
The question is this. He says that Stokely says that he's concerned mainly with black people. And yet the man who asked the question says that Stokely addresses himself to the whole nation at times, speaks as if he were speaking to the whole of the country. The question was so long, I forgot the second half. What's the rest of
The
it?
second half was, is it possible for then Black Power advocates who other than myself suggest what happens to be frightening methods, is it then possible for us to suggest a way for the white man to get out of his oppression? Yeah. I don't know if that's possible. I think that that's really up to white activists who should start moving into the white community and starting to speak to that oppression. I do not want white people to speak to the oppression of black people. I will not be as presumptuous as to speak to the oppression of white people.
There's a couple people out there somewhere in the crowd, Jeff Sherrill and Alice Embry. If anybody sees them, will you ask them to come up here? Now then. Okay, there's a man yelling over there. He wants to know if Mr. Carmichael is going to San Antonio this week.
No, I'm not. No, I'm not.
Man back there with the blue short sleeve shirt on. He wants to know how Mr. Carmichael would revise the poverty program.
Well, I think the poverty program works from two basic assumptions which I disagree with. I think that they're really fallacious. Number one, they work on the assumption is that you can bring together a coalition of forces which make a tripod coalition. That is, poor people, public figures, government, established structure, and technicians. And that what you usually have is 2/3 outnumbering the 1/3, the poor. That is, the technicians are not poor, and the power structure is not poor. And so they're both of them together outbid the poor. So they never really have a voice. And then secondly, I think the assumption of the poverty program is that if someone is poor, it is because of his own individual blight. That is, he was born on the wrong side of the track, so had too many children, didn't go to school, and all of that nonsense. I believe that poverty is well calculated in this country, and it is systematic. So that if you're going to talk about smashing poverty, you must talk about getting rid of government officials who their position exists out of the poor, and getting rid of technicians, letting the poor people control those programs themselves completely.
Okay, the red-headed girl with the flowers. She says, other than economic boycotts, what other means does Mr. Carmichael advocate for bringing economic power to recognize black power?
Can't think of any right now. We just go along with economic boycotts.
All right, there's a fellow waving his hand. He's got a blue short sleeve shirt. The question is, do the Harlem or Watts riots have any place in the Black Power movement?
Oh, they're not riots, they're called rebellions. And what they represent is that black people are no longer going to let a hunky cop come into our neighborhood, beat us up, and walk out scot-free. When they touch one of us, they're going to have to face all of us. So that at least the police in Nashville and Watts and Harlem know that their days of free head whooping on black people are over. A recognition of that allows for us to do the type of organizing that we have to do and to put them out our community. Let the Nashville cops come and police your community. They're white, you're white, you can have them. We want black cops.
Okay, there's a man over here in a green cowboy shirt, sleeves rolled up. He says, what are the future possibilities of black people with the Republican Party?
There's no hope.
That's got it.
Thank you very much.